The champagne glass felt heavier than it should have. That was the first thing I noticed. Not the crowd, not the music, not even the way every single person in that ballroom seemed to have memorized exactly where he was standing. Just the weight of the glass in my hand, the condensation slipping between my fingers like I couldn't hold on to anything properly that night. I should have stayed home. I'd told myself that 3 times while getting dressed. Once when I couldn't zip my own gown, once when the cab took 40 minutes, and once more when I walked through the entrance of the Whitmore Hotel and felt the shift in the air that always came with Jihoon's events. That particular stillness, like the room was holding its breath. I worked for a catering company, upscale private events, corporate dinners, the kind of gatherings where nobody looked at you directly unless they needed something. I'd been doing it for 2 years, long enough to move through expensive rooms without feeling out of place, long enough to read a crowd in under 10 minutes. Servers were invisible here. That was the whole point. Except tonight I wasn't working. Tonight Marcus, my coworker, my friend, the only person at Prestige Event Services who actually remembered my birthday, had convinced me to come as his +1 to a charity gala his cousin had organized. It's just a fancy dinner, Arya. Free food, open bar, you don't have to talk to anyone. That's what he'd said. Free food, open bar. He hadn't mentioned whose event it actually was. I found out when I walked in and saw the security. Not the standard hired muscle type standing by the door, but the kind that blends in, suits that cost more than my rent, eyes that never stop moving. I'd seen that particular configuration before. 3 months ago at a private dinner in Midtown. 6 months before that at a rooftop event in the meatpacking district. Different venues, same invisible architecture of control. My stomach had dropped before my brain caught up. Jihoon. I hadn't seen him yet. I didn't need to. The room already felt like him, precise, contained, expensive in a way that didn't announce itself. Marcus had disappeared somewhere near the bar, probably already charming someone's girlfriend. And I was standing alone near the east wall holding a glass of champagne I didn't remember picking up, trying to decide whether to find a corner or find the exit. Then I heard his voice. Not loud, never loud. Jihoon didn't raise his voice. I'd learned that quickly, working his events. He spoke at a volume that made people lean in, and somehow that was more commanding than anything else I'd ever witnessed. Low, even, with that particular cadence that wasn't quite American and wasn't quite not. Words that landed like they'd been considered long before they left his mouth. I turned slowly. The way you do when you already know what you're going to see is going to cost you something. He was standing near the far end of the room, beside one of the tall windows that overlooked Fifth Avenue. Dressed in all black, jacket, shirt, no tie, the collar open just enough to show the edge of the tattoos that climbed his neck. His hair was pushed back, and in the yellow light of the chandeliers, he looked like something that didn't belong to ordinary hours. Around him, the usual constellation. 2 men positioned at a careful distance, close enough to act, far enough to seem like furniture. And beside him, standing close, hand resting on his arm with the ease of someone who'd earned that right, was a woman I didn't recognize. She was beautiful. Of course she was. Tall. Pale dark hair pinned up, wearing a deep emerald dress that probably had a name I'd never heard of. She was speaking to him, and he was listening, and the particular quality of his attention, the fact that he was actually listening, not just waiting, made something tighten in my chest in a way I didn't want to examine. I looked away, took a sip of champagne, told myself it meant nothing. I'd met Jihoon properly 7 months ago. A private dinner for 12 at a penthouse in Tribeca. The kind of job where we were briefed beforehand on what not to do, what not to hear, how not to look at certain people. I'd almost laughed at the briefing until I walked in and understood immediately that it was serious. He'd noticed me because I'd broken a rule. Not a dangerous one. I'd made eye contact, direct, accidental, for maybe 2 seconds before I remembered myself and looked at the tablecloth. In a room full of people making very deliberate efforts not to see him clearly, I'd looked straight at him like he was just a person. He'd called me over. Just a slight gesture, one finger barely lifting from the table. And when I came, he'd said very quietly, "You're new." "To this event," I'd answered, because I was nervous, and honesty was my default defense mechanism. Something in his expression had shifted, almost imperceptibly. "Don't look so afraid," he'd said. "It makes my guests uncomfortable." I didn't know if that was a threat or a reassurance. I still didn't know, 7 months later. What I knew was that after that night, Prestige kept booking me for his events specifically. Not officially, nobody said his name on the assignment sheet, but I learned to recognize the pattern. Learned which venues, which preparation protocol, which particular silence in the briefing room meant him. And somehow, gradually, without anything I could point to or describe properly, I'd started to matter to those evenings in a way that went beyond carrying trays. He'd remember what I'd said at the last event. He'd redirect conversations when I was nearby, as if he didn't mind me hearing. Once, when another guest had been rude to me, dismissive, that particular brand of cruelty that rich people thought was invisible, Jihoon had said 3 words to the man that I hadn't caught, and the man had gone white and apologized to me within the minute. Jihoon never mentioned it. I never asked. I told myself it was professional, that he valued discretion, that servers who were reliable were simply kept close. I told myself a lot of things. Now I watched him tilt his head slightly toward the woman in green, and she laughed. A real laugh, head back, hand tightening on his arm. And he didn't pull away. He didn't smile exactly, but there was something in his posture that was different from the controlled stillness I was used to. Something almost relaxed. My champagne glass was empty. I hadn't noticed drinking it. This is why you don't come to these things as a guest, I thought. This is exactly why. I turned toward the nearest table to set the glass down, and when I straightened up, I found one of Jihoon's men standing 4 feet away, looking directly at me. Not hostile. Not approaching. Just looking. With the particular quality of attention that meant a message had already been sent and received, and I was now part of a sequence I hadn't agreed to. My heart did something stupid in my chest. Across the room, Jihoon hadn't turned around. He was still in conversation, still composed, still beside the woman in green. But somehow, in a way I had no rational explanation for, I knew with complete certainty that he was aware I was there. I had to make a decision, and I had about 30 seconds to make it. I found Marcus by the bar, which surprised exactly no one. He was mid-laugh when I reached him, his jacket already slightly crooked, champagne in one hand and a small plate of bruschetta balanced in the other, like he'd mastered the art of existing without inconvenience. I grabbed his elbow, probably harder than I needed to. "Hey," he started. "Whose event is this?" I asked, keeping my voice low. "Marcus. Whose event?" He had the decency to look guilty, which meant he already knew I knew. "My cousin organized the charity component. I wasn't lying about that. She just coordinates with the primary host team." "The primary host. Aria. Say the name." He glanced sideways, a reflex, like the name itself required checking whether the room was listening. That told me everything. "Kang," he said, barely audible. "Kang Jihoon. Look, I didn't think it would be a big deal. You've worked his events before. Working and attending are not the same thing, Marcus. You look amazing tonight. You've got a free drink in your hand, and the canapes are genuinely outstanding." I let go of his elbow, took a breath. He meant well. He always meant well, in that particular way that didn't account for the things he didn't know about, which in this case were considerable. I'd never told Marcus about the specific texture of my relationship with Jihoon's world. How to even begin? Well, he's technically my employer through a third party, except he's also apparently aware of my presence in rooms at all times, And there was one night in November when he walked me to a cab without explanation, and I spent 3 days trying to convince myself it hadn't meant anything. "I'm going to get some air," I said. "The terrace is on the 4th floor," Marcus offered, already returning to his conversation. I moved toward the edge of the room, keeping close to the wall the way I always did when I was working these events, the muscle memory of invisibility. The ballroom was full by now, maybe 200 people, the kind of crowd that made a noise like a single living thing. I passed a cluster of men in dark suits who stopped talking when I walked by, which might have been coincidence and probably wasn't. I kept my eyes ahead. The terrace door was propped slightly open. The night air hit me before I even reached it. Cold for April. Sharp and real in a way the recycled warmth of the ballroom wasn't. I slipped outside and let the door fall most of the way closed behind me. The terrace was empty. Below, 5th Avenue moved with its usual indifference. Yellow cabs, headlights, the distant sound of a horn. I walked to the railing and stood there for a moment, just breathing, letting the cold work on the heat in my face. "It's not your business," I told myself. "What he does, who he's with, what he promises anyone, none of that is your business. You came here as a guest. You'll stay an hour, eat something that didn't come from your own refrigerator, and leave. That's it." The telling myself things strategy hadn't been working well lately, but I kept attempting it. I heard the door behind me. I didn't turn around. The footsteps were too measured to be accidental, too quiet to be anyone who hadn't spent years learning how to move in expensive rooms. I felt the specific gravity of his presence before he reached the railing, that adjustment in the air, the thing I'd noticed the very first night and never been able to explain to myself properly. He stopped a few feet away, not beside me, slightly behind, positioned the way he always was, where he could see both me and the door at the same time. The silence lasted maybe 10 seconds. With Ji-hoon, silence wasn't uncomfortable the way it was with other people. It was just weighted, full of something. "You're not working tonight," he said. It wasn't a question. "No." Marcus Webb's guest. I finally turned to look at him. Up close, in the terrace light, the tattoos on his neck were more visible, dark, intricate, layered like a language I'd never be fluent in. His expression was what it always was, composed, unreadable, with that quality of focus that made you feel like the most significant thing in whatever space you shared. "You know Marcus," I said. "I know everyone in this building." A pause. "You seemed like you were leaving." I was getting air. Something moved in his eyes, not quite amusement, not quite not. "The air is the same inside. The air inside has 200 people in it." He looked at me for a moment, and I made myself hold eye contact, the way I'd accidentally done that first night, because I'd learned that looking away felt like losing something. "You looked uncomfortable," he said. I nearly laughed. "I'm fine." I didn't say you weren't. The distinction was precise, deliberate. Uncomfortable and not fine weren't the same thing, and he'd made sure I knew he understood the difference. "You've been to dozens of my events. As staff. And tonight you're not staff." He said it slowly, like he was turning something over. "Does that change how the room feels?" I didn't answer that, because the honest answer was yes, and the reason it felt different was standing 4 feet away from me asking carefully phrased questions in the cold, and I wasn't prepared to navigate where that admission would go. "I saw you earlier," I said instead. "Inside, with someone." Absolutely nothing changed in his face. "Chen Yuna," he said. "She represents an investor group from Seattle." "You don't have to explain." "I know I don't." He said it without sharpness. Matter of fact, the way he said most things. "I'm explaining because you walked to this side of the room after you saw us." The accuracy of that landed on me with a particular discomfort. I'd thought I was subtle. I'd thought I'd been reading him from a safe enough distance that my reactions were private. The idea that he'd tracked my movement across a 200-person ballroom while appearing to be entirely focused on someone else. That shouldn't have surprised me by now, and somehow it still did. I needed air, I repeated. Arya. My name in his mouth still did something I hadn't developed immunity to. He used it rarely, and always with that particular weight, like he'd thought about whether to use it first. I looked at the skyline instead of at him. She's an investor, he said again, quiet, final, like closing a door. I nodded once. It wasn't really about Chen Yuna, and we both knew it. It was about the shape of everything I couldn't name, the 7 months of almost something, the way his world kept pulling me into its orbit, despite the fact that I was a caterer from Crown Heights, who didn't belong anywhere near the Whitmore Hotel as a guest. It was about the woman in green, and the ease of her hand on his arm, and the laugh she'd gotten out of him, and the part of me I was still pretending didn't exist that had watched all of it from across a ballroom, and felt the specific ache of something I'd never been offered. I should go back inside, I said. He didn't move, didn't step aside, didn't say, don't go. He wouldn't. That wasn't how he operated. But he also didn't shift the weight of the silence, didn't release me from it the way he could have with a single word. Then his phone buzzed in his jacket. Once, twice. He glanced at it. The briefest look, the kind that processed information in under a second, and something in his posture changed, almost imperceptibly. A tension that came in and immediately got locked down. Stay on the terrace, he said, and his voice was different. Not louder. Just certain, the way an instruction is certain when it isn't optional. What? But he was already moving back toward the door, phone to his ear, speaking Korean in a low continuous stream, and the two men who had apparently been standing at the terrace entrance, I hadn't even seen them, and I'd been standing there for 10 minutes, were repositioning themselves in a way that suddenly made the terrace feel much smaller. I turned back to the railing. My hands found the cold metal and held on. Below, Fifth Avenue kept moving. Indifferent, continuous. And somewhere behind me, through the glass and the crowd and the careful architecture of his world, something was happening that I wasn't supposed to see. And he had made sure I was outside, contained, accounted for, before he walked toward whatever it was. I stood there for a long moment, in the cold, understanding something I hadn't let myself understand before. He knew exactly where I was. He always had. They kept me on that terrace for 22 minutes. I know because I checked my phone twice, once at minute 8, when the cold had worked its way through the fabric of my gown, and I started seriously considering whether ignoring Jihoon's instruction was a survivable decision, and once at minute 17, when one of the men by the door shifted his weight in a way that felt like a response to something I hadn't heard. At minute 22, the same man stepped aside and gave me a single, almost imperceptible nod. Permission to re-enter my own evening. I walked back into the ballroom with my arms crossed against the cold still sitting in my skin. And the first thing I noticed was that the room had changed. Not dramatically. The music was the same. The crowd density was the same. The chandeliers still threw that warm amber light over 200 people performing wealth at each other. But there were fewer dark suits near the east wall, and the particular quality of tension that had lived under the surface of the event like a current was gone. Whatever had happened had been resolved, and resolved cleanly, and no one in that room who wasn't supposed to know about it would ever know. That was the world I kept accidentally standing at the edge of. Marcus found me before I found him, appearing at my shoulder with a fresh glass of champagne and the look of a man who had been watching a door for 20 minutes. You okay? Fine, I said, taking the glass. You were outside for a while. The air was good. He gave me a look that said he didn't entirely believe me, but had made a personal policy decision not to press it. One of Marcus's better qualities. We stood together for a moment, watching the room, and I was grateful for the normalcy of him. Slightly crooked jacket, bruschetta crumbs on his lapel. Absolutely no awareness of the undercurrents that had just moved through the space around us. I didn't see Ji-hoon for the next 40 minutes. I ate something. Small plates circulating on trays. The kind of food that was more architecture than sustenance. And I talked to Marcus's cousin briefly, a sharp-eyed woman named Denise, who organized charitable galas for a living, and had strong opinions about floral arrangements. I laughed at something she said. I felt almost normal. Then I went to the restroom, and that's where I heard it. The women's lounge on the 4th floor was the kind of space that cost more to maintain than my apartment. Marble counters, low lighting, a small seating area with upholstered chairs near the entrance. When I pushed the door open, 2 women were sitting in those chairs, and they didn't register me immediately because I moved quietly, and they were deep in conversation. Confirmed it himself, apparently. Yuna told Miriam directly. When? Tonight. That's why she's here, isn't it? He had her flown in from Seattle specifically. I'd stopped moving. I was standing just inside the door, partially behind the partition that divided the entrance from the lounge area, and I understood I should either announce myself or leave, and I did neither. She said he used the word future, a pause that had weight in it. She said he told her he saw a future with her. You don't say that to someone you're just keeping around. Ji-hoon doesn't say anything he doesn't mean. Exactly. A small silence. The sound of a compact clicking open. She's been patient, 3 years. The distance, the everything that comes with him. If he's finally saying it out loud, it means it's decided. I turned around and walked out. The hallway was empty. I walked to the end of it, to where a window seat was built into the alcove near the elevator bank, and I sat down on it, and I stared at the wall across from me, and I waited to feel something I could identify. It took a moment. Then it arrived. Not sharp, not dramatic. Just a slow, settling wait. The kind that comes when something you'd been pretending wasn't real becomes real in a way you can't re-pretend. I'd known on some level that what existed between Ji-hoon and me was a thing I'd been constructing mostly from my own materials. His attention, yes. Real, specific, impossible to dismiss. The way he remembered. The way he made space. The cab in November. The terrace tonight. These things were real. But real wasn't the same as what I'd been quietly, carefully building from them in the private architecture of my own chest. He saw a future with her. Yuna, the woman in green. The one who'd been patient for 3 years. The one who knew what she was agreeing to when she agreed to it. Who existed inside his world rather than perpetually on its border. Who was here tonight because he'd had her flown in, which meant something that didn't require interpretation. I sat with it for a minute. Maybe 2. Long enough to let it be real. Then I stood up, went back to the lounge, fixed my lipstick in the mirror with hands that were steady, and walked back to the elevator. I found Marcus, told him I was heading out, gave him a hug that I meant. He looked at me with that particular concerned quality he had sometimes, the one he usually suppressed in favor of being easy company. You sure? Long week, I said. The food was great. Thank your cousin. He caught my arm gently as I turned. Arya, you good? Yeah. I smiled, and it wasn't entirely false. I'm good. I meant to walk straight to the coat check and then the exit. Instead, I found myself taking a longer route along the edge of the ballroom. Not consciously, not strategically. The way your feet sometimes make decisions your brain is still catching up to. And I saw him. Ji-hoon was standing near the center of the room now, Chen Yuna beside him again, and he was speaking to a group of 4 people with that composed authority that never looked like authority until you were on the receiving end of it. He wasn't performing anything. He was just present. Fully, completely present, the way most people never manage to be. He looked up. Not toward where I was, but he turned slightly, a fraction, and his eyes found me across the moving crowd with an accuracy that had stopped surprising me and started unsettling me in a new way entirely, like a kind of knowing that didn't require searching. I held his gaze for exactly 1 second. Then I turned and walked toward the exit. I didn't look back, and I told myself that was a choice, and it mostly was. The coat check attendant brought my jacket. I tipped her. I pushed through the door into the cold proper of the April night. The street noise was immediate and indifferent and a relief in a way I hadn't expected. I walked half a block before I stopped. My phone was in my hand without my deciding to take it out. I stood on the sidewalk in the yellow light of the hotel awning, still spilling out behind me, and I looked at it for a moment, and then I put it back in my bag. There was nothing to do with a phone. No message to send. No call to make. Nothing that needed to be said. He had a future with someone. 3 years of patience. A woman who flew across the country because he asked. And I had 7 months of careful attention that I'd been slowly, privately translating into something it had never been offered as. I started walking toward the subway. The city moved around me the way it always did. Loud, uncaring, brilliantly indifferent. A cab splashed through a puddle near the curb. Someone's music leaked from a window above. The cold felt different now, less sharp, like it had already done what it came to do. I was halfway down the block when my phone buzzed. I stopped, looked at the screen. 1 message. No name. The number was unsaved, but I recognized it the way you recognize a voice you've only heard a few times, but that has somehow lodged itself somewhere deep and specific. Where are you going? Not a question. Never a question. With him. Just the words, flat and certain, with the particular quality of someone who already knew the answer and was offering me the chance to say it first. I stood there in the April cold, coat open, phone in both hands, and I read it 4 times. Then I put my phone in my bag without answering, and I kept walking. I didn't sleep well. That wasn't unusual. I hadn't slept well in months, not since the pattern of his events had started overlapping with the pattern of my thoughts in ways I couldn't cleanly separate anymore. But that night was different. That night I lay in my apartment in Crown Heights, with the window cracked 2 inches, because I couldn't stand the stillness of sealed air, and I stared at the ceiling and listened to the street, and turned the message over and over in my mind. Like something with an edge, I kept finding new ways to cut myself on. Where are you going? I hadn't answered. I still hadn't answered, 12 hours later, standing in my kitchen in yesterday's sweater making coffee I didn't particularly want. My phone sat on the counter face up, which was how I knew I was lying to myself about not caring. A person who didn't care would have put it face down. The coffee finished brewing. I poured a cup. I looked at the phone. No follow-up message. Nothing. Just the one, sitting there from last night like a question that had decided to be patient. I thought about Yuna, about the word future. Dropped into a conversation between 2 women in an upholstered chair, like it was a fact that had already finished becoming true. Jehoon didn't say anything he didn't mean. That's what the woman had said, and I believed it completely, which was the problem. I believed it because I'd spent 7 months watching him choose his words the way a watchmaker chooses components. Nothing extraneous, nothing imprecise. If he'd said future, he meant future. I drank my coffee. I got dressed. I had a shift at a corporate luncheon in Midtown at 11, a straightforward job, 50 guests, buffet service, out by 3. The kind of work that required enough attention to keep my hands busy, and not quite enough to keep my head busy, which was either exactly what I needed or exactly what I didn't, and I wouldn't know which until I was in it. I took the A train. I stood the whole way, which I preferred. Something about holding the overhead bar and feeling the car move under me, the specific rhythm of tunnels and stations, made thinking feel more manageable, more like motion and less like drowning. My phone buzzed at DeKalb Avenue. I looked at it. Not Jehoon. Marcus, you left early. You good? And then, a minute later, without waiting for my response, don't be weird about last night. He's just a guy. I almost laughed out loud in the subway car. Marcus, who knew maybe 15% of the situation and had somehow still arrived at the precise wrong thing to say. Just a guy. The man who had flown a woman across the country because he'd decided she was his future, who tracked movement across crowded rooms without appearing to look, who had sent 2 words into the cold night after me like a hand catching a door before it closed. Sure, just a guy. I typed back, I'm fine, talk later. Sent it, put the phone away. The luncheon was in a glass-walled conference space on the 38th floor of a building near Bryant Park, the kind of corporate event where everyone was performing being relaxed during what was actually a business meeting with better food. I moved through it on autopilot, replenishing trays, clearing plates, navigating the particular social geometry of people who were eating and networking simultaneously. My supervisor, a brisk woman named Carolyn, who'd been doing this for 15 years and had the energy of someone who'd made peace with invisibility, gave me one approving nod midway through the service that meant I was doing fine. I was always doing fine. That was my particular skill. Showing up, being competent, leaving no trace. It was almost 2 o'clock when I went down to the service corridor to restock, and I found one of Jehoon's men standing outside the freight elevator. I recognized him, the one from the terrace, the one who'd given me the nod. He was in a different suit today, charcoal instead of black, but the posture was identical, and the quality of stillness was unmistakable. He wasn't looking at me in a threatening way. He was just standing there with the particular patience of someone who had been told to wait and was waiting without opinion. I stopped. What is this? Mr. Kang would like a few minutes, he said. Neutral, professional, like this was a completely ordinary sentence. I'm working. Your shift ends at 3. He's aware. The fact that Jehoon knew my schedule, that someone had looked into it, that he'd sent a person here in advance, should have alarmed me more than it did. What it actually did was something more complicated. Something that lived in the same neighborhood as Alarmed, but with different furniture. Where? I said. Downstairs. He has a car. I stood there for a moment, weighing it. The rational options were clear. I could say no. Go back upstairs, finish my shift, take the train home, and continue the process of building appropriate distance that I'd started last night when I walked out of the Whitmore and didn't answer his message. That was the sensible architecture. Instead, I heard myself say, "Tell him I'll be down at 3. The man nodded once and stepped back. I went back upstairs and finished my shift. At 3:02, I walked out of the building onto 40th Street, and the car was there. Black, unmarked, parked at the curb with a second man standing near the rear door. He opened it when he saw me. I got in. Jehoon was already inside. He was sitting against the far door, jacket off, one arm resting along the back of the seat. In the daylight, real daylight, gray and flat through the tinted windows, he looked different than he did at his events. Still composed, still precise, but without the particular formality that venues added to him. More like himself, maybe, though I had no reliable information about what that actually was. He looked at me when I got in, didn't say anything immediately. The car pulled into traffic. "You didn't answer," he said. "I know." "Why?" I looked out the window at Midtown moving past. "Because I didn't know what to say." A pause. "That's not like you. You don't know me that well." "Aria." The name again, weighted, placed. "I know you well enough." The confidence of that, not arrogant, just factual, the way he stated things he was certain of, landed somewhere in my chest and stayed there. I turned to look at him. He was watching me with that quality of attention that I'd once mistakenly categorized as professional interest, and had been slowly, reluctantly, reclassifying ever since. "I heard something last night," I said. I'd decided on the way down in the elevator that I wasn't going to perform not knowing. I was tired of performing. About Yuna. Nothing changed in his face, but there was a stillness that arrived, slightly different from his regular stillness, more intentional. "What did you hear?" "That you told her you saw a future with her." I kept my voice even. 3 years. That you had her fly in because that it's decided. The car moved through a yellow light. Outside, a food cart vendor was arguing cheerfully with someone in a language I didn't catch. "Who told you that?" he said. "It doesn't matter." "It matters because it's not accurate." I looked at him. "Which part?" "Any of it." He said it quietly, without emphasis, the way he said things he considered settled. Then, after a moment, "Yuna and I have known each other for 4 years. Her family has business connections to mine. That's the extent of it. She doesn't know that." Something moved behind his eyes. A recognition, maybe. Something he was filing and would address. "No," he said. "She may not." The honesty of that was its own kind of thing. He wasn't performing innocence, wasn't constructing a defense. Just acknowledging the gap between what he understood the situation to be and what someone else had been building in the same space. I recognized that gap. I'd been living in my own version of it. "Why am I in this car?" I asked. He looked at me for a long moment. The city moved outside. "Because you walked out," he said, "and you didn't answer. And I don't." A brief pause, the first I'd ever heard him take. The first time I'd ever seen him reach for a word. I don't do well with things I haven't been given an explanation for. In 7 months, I had never once heard him say, "I don't do well with anything." The words sat in the car between us like something delicate that had been set down carefully. I looked at his hands, still, folded, resting in his lap with a control that was habitual and constant. And I thought about the terrace, about the text message, about the man sent to a freight elevator in Midtown to wait without opinion. "You could have just called," I said. "You wouldn't have answered." He was right, and we both knew it. The car stopped at a light somewhere in the 50s, and for a moment the only sound was the engine idling and the muffled city outside. And I sat with the impossible fact of being in this space with this person, neither of us pretending anymore that this was about catering work, or event staffing, or any of the other categories we'd been using to file what this actually was. "I didn't know what I was walking away from," I said, finally, quietly. "I still don't." He held my gaze. Something shifted in his expression. Not much, just enough. "I know," he said. And then, as if that were a complete thought, he looked out the window. The light changed. The car moved, but his hand, resting on the seat between us, had shifted 2 inches closer to mine. Barely noticeable. Deliberate in the way that only things he chose were deliberate. I didn't move away. The car took me home. Not to a restaurant, not to a neutral location, not to one of the controlled environments where Jehoon conducted everything else in his life. He asked for my address with the same tone he used for everything. Quiet, assuming compliance not through pressure but through a kind of gravity. And I gave it. And the driver adjusted the route without a word, and 20 minutes later we were idling on my street in Crown Heights, which looked exactly as ordinary as it was. A corner bodega with hand-lettered signs, a group of kids on bikes, a woman walking a dog so small it was practically a rumor. Jehoon looked out the window at all of it without comment. I should have gotten out immediately. I had my bag in my lap and my hand near the door handle, and the entire sensible structure of self-preservation available to me. Instead, I sat there for a moment, in the particular silence that existed only in his presence, Not uncomfortable, never quite comfortable, something in between that I'd stopped trying to name. "The thing with Yuna," I said. "You need to tell her." He turned to look at me. "Whatever she thinks is happening, whatever she's been telling people." I held his gaze, steadier than I felt. "She's been patient for 3 years. She deserves an honest conversation, not just a slow disappearance. A beat." He looked at me with that unreadable quality, and then something behind it. Something I didn't have enough information to fully decode but recognized as a form of being seen. "Yes," he said. Just that. "Yes." Not a defense, not an explanation. An acknowledgement that arrived without friction. I nodded once. Opened the door. "Arya." I stopped, half in, half out of the car, the Crown Heights air replacing the climate-controlled quiet of the interior. "Saturday," he said. "I have a dinner. Private. At the house in Riverside." A pause that wasn't quite a pause, more like a space he was making. "I'd like you to come. Not as staff." I stood there in the open door of a car that cost more than a year of my rent, on a street where Mrs. Patterson from 4B was now watching from her window with unconcealed curiosity. And I thought about 7 months of almost something. About the terrace. About a message sent into the cold that didn't ask a question but somehow was one. About a hand that had moved 2 inches and waited. "I'll think about it," I said. Something in his expression shifted, barely, just at the edges. Almost, in someone with a less controlled face, a smile. "All right," he said. I got out, closed the door. The car stayed at the curb for a moment, engine running, and I didn't look back because I was working on a personal policy of not performing my own uncertainty for an audience. I walked to my building door, got my key out, let myself in. From the lobby window, I saw the car pull away. I spent Thursday existing in the ordinary texture of my life with unusual attention, the way you sometimes do when you've been reminded that ordinary has its own specific weight. I worked a breakfast service in the financial district. I called my mother, who wanted to tell me about a cousin's engagement, and asked if I was eating enough, in that order of priority. I reorganized my closet, which I'd been meaning to do for months, and found a cardigan I'd thought I'd lost, and experienced a disproportionate amount of satisfaction about it. I didn't think about Saturday. I thought about it constantly. Friday afternoon, I was restocking supplies in the prestige storage room when Carolyn appeared in the doorway with a clipboard and a look that meant administrative something. "You're off the books Saturday," she said, not looking up. "Override from the client coordinator. Personal day." I straightened. "I didn't request a personal day." "No, but it was requested on your behalf." She made a note. "Apparently you have a prior commitment." She left before I could respond. I stood among the folded linens and stacked glassware and understood, with a clarity that should have been irritating, and was instead something else entirely, that Jehoon had already decided I was coming to dinner on Saturday. Not because he'd override my refusal. He wouldn't. I was certain of that now in a way I hadn't been at the beginning, but because he knew me well enough, apparently, to understand that my "I'll think about it" had already been a yes. The embarrassing part was that he wasn't wrong. I sat down on a supply crate and laughed, quietly, alone among the linens. A short, real laugh that surprised me a little. Then I took out my phone and typed a message to the number I'd never saved. "You had Carolyn give me a personal day." The response came in under a minute. "Your shift would have conflicted. That's not how personal days work. It is now." I stared at the screen. The possessiveness of it, practical, unapologetic, arriving without ceremony, was absurd. It was the kind of thing that should have made me close the conversation and reconsider my entire series of recent decisions. Instead, I felt something warm settle in my chest, unhelpfully. "What time?" I typed. 7. I'll send a car at 6:30. I put my phone in my pocket and went back to work. Saturday arrived gray and quiet, the kind of April day that couldn't decide whether it was still winter. The house in Riverside turned out to be a townhouse on a tree-lined street. Nothing ostentatious from the outside, just clean lines and dark brick, the kind of architecture that communicated wealth through restraint. The car stopped in front of it at 6:52. I'd been early, which I always was, which meant I'd spent 20 minutes telling myself to stop checking how I looked. The door opened before I reached it. Not Jihoon. One of his men. Same practiced neutrality. He led me through a hallway that smelled like cedar and something cooking, into a sitting room with low furniture and walls that held actual art, not decoration. Pieces that had been chosen by someone with specific taste, and no need to explain it. I stood there alone for maybe 2 minutes. Then Jihoon came in. He was in a dark shirt, no jacket, sleeves pushed to his forearms, the most casual I'd ever seen him. The tattoos disappeared into the fabric, and the overall effect was of someone who was, for once, not managing a public-facing version of himself. He looked at me the way he always looked at me, and I let myself look back the way I'd been carefully not allowing myself to for 7 months. "You came," he said. "You arranged my schedule," I said. It seemed rude not to. That edge of almost smile again. "Sit down." The dinner was small, just the two of us, which I hadn't been certain of until I was in it. Food that someone had prepared and quietly disappeared from, leaving no trace except the meal itself. We talked in a way I hadn't expected. Not about his world, not about the careful perimeter of things I was and wasn't supposed to know. About other things. His grandmother, who'd raised him partly, and who he spoke about with the only uncomplicated softness I'd ever heard from him. About why I'd started catering, which was a practical answer I gave, and then, because the room had a quality that made honesty feel less dangerous, a real one. About a trip I'd taken to Georgia 3 years ago, the state, not the country, that had been the last vacation I'd taken, and still lived in my memory with unusual vividness. He listened the way he always listened, completely, without waiting for his turn. At some point the food was gone and neither of us had moved to change anything, and the room had gone quieter in the way rooms do when the evening has shifted from one thing into another. I was looking at the art on the wall across from me, a large canvas, dark blues and black, abstract in a way that somehow still felt like landscape. When he said my name, I turned. He was looking at me with something that wasn't composed, exactly. Still controlled, always controlled. But underneath it, visible to me now in a way it hadn't been in the earlier months. Something that was simply there, present, undisguised. "I need you to understand something," he said quietly. "I don't..." Another pause, that reaching for words that I'd only seen twice. "The way I've been operating, keeping you at the edge of things. That was me managing something I wasn't prepared to address directly." I held very still. "I'm addressing it now," he said. Outside, a car passed on the quiet street. Inside, the room held its breath in the way rooms sometimes did around him, except this time I was part of what was being held. I thought about who I'd been 7 months ago. The woman who'd made accidental eye contact at a dinner table and answered a question honestly because fear made her default to the truth. I thought about the version of me who'd stood on a terrace in the cold, telling herself the air was the same inside. Who'd walked out of a ballroom in silence carrying something she hadn't let herself name. "Okay," I said. Just that. One word, quiet, returned to him with the same weight he'd put into his own. He looked at me for a long moment. Then he leaned forward, rested his forearms on his knees, and the distance between us was simply less. No announcement, no gesture toward it, just a shift in geometry that was also, unmistakably, a decision. "Okay," he said back. And somehow, in the silence that followed, in that particular room on that particular quiet street, with the city moving around us in its indifferent way and the last of April sitting gray and still outside the windows. That was enough. Not everything resolved, not everything mapped, not a single guarantee offered or requested. Just two people who had been carefully not saying something for 7 months, finally in the same room with the thing itself. I didn't need it explained. I'd spent enough time in his world to know that the most significant moments were the ones that arrived without announcement. I looked at him, and he looked at me, and for the first time since any of this started, I wasn't standing at the edge of anything. I was already inside.